Good morning, everybody. So good to be here. Uh, we're going to school today, and I am very excited about it. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Margaret Mitchell. I'm President and CEO of the YWCA of Greater Cleveland. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to have Cynthia Connolly with us today. And I just want to take a moment and just thank Verizon for making all of this possible, our great partner. And Jessica, thank you. You are absolutely wonderful to the Cleveland community and certainly to the YWCA. So thank you, Verizon. And good morning, Cynthia.
Good morning. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I am wonderful. I am so excited to introduce you. Cynthia is the Development Director of Policy Matters.
Policy Matters Ohio.
Policy Matters Ohio, thank you. She's very involved in the community. She teaches a course at Kent State on Native American history. She is a member of the, I want to get this right, and I have been practicing all morning, the Little Traverse Band.
Mm-hmm. It's the
Ottawa
tribe. Yeah,
Little the Ottawa tribe in Michigan.
Correct, northern Michigan, yep.
Northern Michigan.
Yeah, it's Petoskey and Harbor Springs, Michigan area, if anyone's been up there, and it's kind of the tip of the mitt.
I am so jealous of your grounding and your ability to identify yourself by your tribe.
Yeah, it's I usually, when I start these types of discussions, I always introduce myself in my indigenous language. So I'll do that here. Ani dindisikwe indishnakas aji jakindodum waganakasing odawa and donjaba. So I just said that, hello, my name is Cynthia Connolly. My Anishinaabe name is Blue Jay Woman. I am a citizen of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians, which is located in northern Michigan. We call it Land of the Crooked Tree, which is the Waganakasing Odawa part. And I'm from the Crane Clan. So I usually try to situate myself and tell you who my people are.
I love that. And it is, it just so resonates in my heart. And I have I've been on a quest for a number of years. You know, I've been to West Africa 3 times, the first time going in 1997. But I recently just did a African ancestry DNA, because that other kit doesn't get you grounded into your tribe. But there is an African ancestry company founded by a woman, and she situates you through the DNA. She's able to situate you in your tribe, and I'm really excited to be able to get grounded there.
Yeah, knowing where your roots are and who your people are always gives you a sense of fulfillment and just connection with your sense of self and your people. For sure.
It's incredibly powerful. Do you remember the first time we met?
The first time we met? Oh, goodness. I feel like, I mean, it was a couple years ago.
Uh-huh.
And I know it was before we did our strategic planning event. But I feel like you have a story here.
It was before our strategic planning event. I actually had seen a photo of a Native American activist and the first Black board chair for YWCA USA. And it just, we were getting ready to celebrate our 150th anniversary of the YWCA Greater Cleveland. And as I was reflecting on how I wanted the year to go and what I wanted to include and how I wanted to celebrate and support the community, I knew that Cuyahoga, and when I think back 150 years ago, I just began to wonder about the grounding of Indigenous women and YWCA, and wanted to make sure that we included and celebrated during that year an Indigenous woman. And I felt it was important, for the organization. Do you remember that?
Yeah, is that the Woman Man Killer
Yeah,
screening?
Woman Man Killer. Yep. And I think that's the photo is Valerie Redhorse, who was the director of the Wilma Mankiller film. Wilma Mankiller, of course, being the first woman to be president of the Cherokee Nation. And Valerie Redhorse directed the film and came for the viewing of the film, which we did at Case in partnership with Flora Mathers Center there at Case. And the story behind Valerie Redhorse is that I went to high school with Valerie Redhorse in Fresno, California, and she was several years ahead of me, and she was the most amazing woman. Having grown up in California, had many friends who were Native Indigenous, but Valerie was the most incredible woman. She would just hold court. So much of what I learned in relearning and the way she would correct, the history that was being, taught at the high school in just this most powerful way. It was just absolutely incredible. She's brilliant. I think I might have told you that I cyber stalked her for years. But it was just so powerful to be able to bring her and to have you part of that and to have Lenac part of that. It was really special.
Yeah, that was a really great night, and really great to connect with Valerie Redhorse, who my mom actually knew through her networks through Indian country. So that was really fun. And I brought my daughters too, which was great to have them see that video.
That's right. When I think about naming and framing, I want to be able to ask you sort of, what are your preferences about how you are addressed or how you hear Indigenous peoples, being addressed? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so everyone is really, they always want to get it right. They want to make sure that we're all, introducing you're introducing somebody correctly, and what do you want to be called? And we see this kind of across all races and ethnicities, right? I think people are becoming really conscious of how we address each other and realizing that names and words have power.
Yes.
And so I've noticed in the last, probably this last generation, and probably more recently in the last 10 years, the shift to the word Indigenous, kind of acknowledging that Indigenous people aren't concentrated in just the lower 48 United States. We also have Native Alaskans, First Nations in Canada, Native Hawaiians. We have folks down in South and Central America. So it's not just the United States. And so making sure that we understand that Indigenous people exist not only here in Turtle Island, but also in Pacific Island in Australia, and we're global, right? We have Indigenous people across the world. I think one thing that I get this question a lot is like, should I call you, are you an Indian, or are you a Native American? Or I always introduce myself usually with my tribe. So I say I'm Odawa, or I'm an Anishinaabe, which is actually a combination of the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations. And I try to explain that we're actually sovereign nations. So much like Mexico or Canada, we have our own governing bodies, our own laws, our own constitution. And so I try to explain that we have both a political and a racial identity. And so when I say that I'm Odawa, I'm also saying, because if you notice when I introduced myself, I said I'm a citizen of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians. This isn't like a membership club, right? So I'm a citizen of a sovereign nation. I vote in our elections. So really trying to embrace that that sovereignty aspect of who we are, versus the racial aspect. So I always try to go with the tribe first. I tend to use Native American versus American Indian, and this is all personal preference, just because I have a lot of Indian American friends, and it can just get really confusing pretty fast. So just out of ease, I tend to navigate towards Native American. The word Indian is definitely, I feel, on the way out. There's a lot of that word kind of lingering around in the jargon that we have, because that was the word that was given to us, right? So that's why you kind of is similar to the NAACP. You know, we have kind of these like historical remnants of these phrases and terms that we once used that we just sort of don't use anymore because it's not an accurate representation of who we are. But the one thing I do want to point out is that we haven't really had the opportunity to define ourselves until your generation, Margaret, until 50 years ago, have we been able to define ourselves. That was the passage of the Self-Determination Act in the mid-70s, followed by the Religious Freedom Act. My mom was 18 until she could freely practice her religion, go, smudge, go to sweat lodge, do sun dances. That was actually all against federal law. You could go to prison for practicing your religion in the United States if you were indigenous. And so for centuries, we have had just like contradictory federal policy defining who we were and who we were not for us. And it was something that's really hard to undo. And having given that opportunity just, one generation ago, it's going to take a minute, right, for us to figure out like how we want to be defined and who we want to be. And having control of that identity also means that we can't have these stereotypical images and representation and misconceptions muddling those waters. And that's kind of what I feel like the crossroads we are at right now, and why you're seeing a lot of the push against Native mascots, team names, Halloween costumes, Columbus Day, Thanksgiving representations, because it's really inaccurate and it's defining who we are for us and not giving us the power to define who we are. And in retrospect, that makes it really difficult for us to tell our own story. So that's why you're seeing a lot of this movement right now around those issues.
It's so incredibly important and powerful. And, I remember in the 70s when so much of this was shifting and happening, and in the early 80s and changing. And so many of the Native Indigenous American families that I knew, including our very close neighbors across the street from us, who I was in and out of their house all the time. I remember it as almost it was a complex time of a lot of feelings and emotions, both happiness and pride, but this odd sadness that I don't know that I was really able to explain or fully articulate as a child. But it is this is a really powerful and important time as we begin to re-examine all of these images that had been pressed into our minds. And obviously for many, Columbus Day is coming up. And I was in a meeting and somebody said, we're having Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, on October 9th, and somebody said, "Oh, that's Columbus Day weekend," and I was like, "Yes,
yeah."
At the YWCA, we think differently about Columbus Day, and we honor and recognize Native Indigenous Americans. And there are always those opportunities for growth and learning and development, and yet it's important for people to dig in themselves. And I want to share an amazing podcast that I listened to earlier this summer. It's called This Land, and it really is. It was very powerful to just get the reinforcement of understanding the sovereignty of the nations, and the recent Supreme Court ruling that reinforced that, and just so many powerful things. But This Land, great podcast. It will really support you in growing and understanding the sovereignty of Native American across the country, but certainly Texas, Oklahoma, and the West, and all of the United States.
Yeah. Another podcast I actually really enjoy listening to is All My Relations, and it's hosted by Matika Wilbur and Dr. Adrienne Keene. And a lot of people ask me, they're like, oh, what books can I read to learn more about Native people? And, where can I go for more information? I was never taught anything. And which I'm sure we can talk about, further in this conversation about that lack of education. But the answer is, exactly how you get your information. It's good to read, right? And when you can, but if you wanted that actual book I'm going to give you, it's going to be this thick and it's going to be filled with a lot of stuff and you probably won't read it. So my advice is to follow those thought leaders and those Indigenous leaders on Twitter, on social, subscribe to these podcasts, start adding in this information into your day-to-day life as you would with any other source of information, because that's how we learn from each other. It's just the interaction with day-to-day things. And that's very difficult to do with Indigenous people because we are less than, we're at 1.5% of the nation's population. And so there's a recent study that came out called Reclaiming Native Truth. And that was kind of really getting to understand this false narrative of Native people that we have across the nation. And they found that 2/3 of Americans have not met a Native person. And that lack of understanding of who we are as a modern people is in part because we don't have those day-to-day interactions. We're not including modern Native issues in our daily consumption, weekly, monthly consumption of news and information. And it's just not in our faces. But then we're also barraged with this onslaught of false information, from news, from media, from pop culture, from sports teams. And so when you're filled with nothing but those misconceptions and stereotypes, that actually, and they've done the research, they found that makes people less likely to support Indigenous social justice rights and issues. So it does inadvertently cause negative harm to our people. And they also found that people who have like Native mascots as their team name are more likely to be discriminatory and prejudiced against other people of color, not just Native Americans. So being barraged by this nonstop, what they call a false narrative is doing a great deal of harm to us, trying to, again, assert our identity, exercise our rights as sovereign nations, fight for our social justice issues, start to like peck away at these horrible socioeconomic statistics that we're seeing coming out of our communities. So that's the one major thing that we're working on. So I highly recommend just really starting to flip that narrative that you've been fed since you were a kid and start, getting into these podcasts, reading these books. Tommy Orange is an author, best-selling New York Times author. His book was absolutely groundbreaking. And it was, he actually wrote the book thinking that just Native people would read it. But it ended up, we did, and it was amazing, but it's exactly what America needs to read right now. And it's a very contemporary piece of fiction, and it's absolutely genius. I adored it. So definitely, get as much of that modern information as you can through your day-to-day things. And definitely This Land is great. The All My Relations podcast is fantastic. So those are my 2 top recommendations.
Tommy Orange is a beautiful writer. And this was one of his first works, right?
I think it was his first book.
Yeah. It's amazing. It's just a beautiful, beautiful book. I do have it and read it, and I don't have it among my books, but I do have Wilma Mankiller's book, just amazing. And I think as you are engaging with young people and schools, and I'm really talking to those joining us today, it is so important to begin to properly frame the narrative of Native Indigenous Americans. It is critically important for us all to take a role in doing this. I know I am a proud graduate of Hampton Institute, now Hampton University. And Hampton was a college that, many people don't realize that historically Black colleges were land-based colleges, and they were really designed for Blacks and Native Americans. And this was a very strong and effective tool around assimilation for Native Americans and Blacks. And I have this old Hampton book. I don't know if you can see it. It was my mother-in-law's. My husband is also a Hampton grad. We're very, like you Michigan, University of Michigan folks,
Yeah.
But
Well, my husband's a Buckeye, so there's that.
Oh, you know what? I didn't know that.
Yeah, he graduated there in undergrad and with his PhD in aerospace. So we are a house divided for sure.
Whoops. But you could see this picture of these two Native American students here, and then I would say that Hampton has a huge archive, and the museum is filled with just amazing artifacts. Sometimes I'm obviously extremely nervous around how they acquired all of that, but you can see that these photos include both Black students and Native American students, and most of the historically Black colleges were really built and framed that way. But there was also a history of removing Indigenous children from their families and sending them to boarding schools that were abusive, not just in the assimilation, but in the treatment of students. And I know Valerie Redhorse told me that her dad actually went to Hampton. He was a Hampton grad as well.
Yeah, when Indian Country saw the children and parents and families at the border being separated and torn away, I mean, this is history repeating itself over and over again. I mean, all of natives everywhere were like, we've seen this. Have we learned nothing? And so that's one of the reasons why a lot of organizations across Indian Country have been really fighting to help these families that were separated at the border, because we have experienced that within our own communities, and we know what the harm is, and we know the multi-generational trauma that comes from that. And so seeing this happen again is really crushing. I know that changing the narrative and making sure that we're talked about in that modern lens and understanding our history and things like that, it's really important. When you were talking earlier in the very beginning of your part there, it reminded me of when I give presentations to local elementary schools. I'll talk to libraries, high schools, senior centers. So it runs the gamut. And one of the first things I always ask is picture a Native American in your mind. What imagery pops in there? What's the first thing you think of? And raise your hand, tell me what you're thinking of. And so it's always tomahawks, arrowheads, feathers, headdresses, chief wahoo. And so I say, okay, well, can someone name a Native American who's alive today? Any Native American. And I've yet to have somebody say an actual name of somebody who's alive today. It's awkward because I just introduced myself and I'm standing in front of them. And I'm like, Cynthia Connolly, anyone? So it really shows you how much work we have to do to really cut through the what I call the false narrative, right? It's just already, we talk about bias that we all have right now, right? And systemic racism. And this is the manifestation of it for Indigenous people. That invisibility and erasure, that is the modern form of racism that our community is facing. And actually this lacrosse stick I have behind me, my husband uses that for ceremony. And one of the teachers that I had brought it in to kind of pass around, because these are kids, they want to see some stuff. So I brought some things from my house. And she called all my stuff artifacts. And I'm like, well, my husband used that just the other month. So it's not actually an artifact. It's still a much used lacrosse stick. He just got it relaced. So again, like
But
these,
lacrosse is a
yeah,
is really was originated by Native Americans and is and still is extremely popular.
yeah,
It has sort of been hijacked, if you will, in terms of how we think about lacrosse as sort of a prep school exclusive
yeah.
sport.
And actually, the Iroquois Nationals right now are a super competitive team. They rank third in the world, which if you think about, you know, the other teams that are ranked right now, like Canada, United States, England, and think of how much talent, that pool they have to select from. And then here we have like the Iroquois Nationals picking just from the Haudenosaunee Nation, and they're ranked third in the world. Like this is their blood. This is what they do. They gifted us this game across the world. And they actually were not allowed to play at the World Games, which is kind of a like this. I believe this is starting to be a stepping stone for there to be lacrosse in the Summer Olympics, which there is not. And so they did not invite the Iroquois Nationals, the
Wow.
third best team in the world, to participate in the World Games. And there was a huge outcry. And I know that that has since been reversed, and Ireland actually gave up their spot so they could play, which was amazing. And I love that we have this relationship with Ireland right now. It goes back, you know, hundreds of years back to the Irish famine when the Choctaw had sent some funds over to Ireland so they could help feed their families. But yeah, Ireland gave up their spot. So now the Iroquois Nationals are going to the World Games, and I can tell you it's a very serious sport back there. Over at Six Nations, where my husband's people are from, they have lacrosse sticks in their cribs for the sons. It's part of the culture and the tradition. That I mean, my husband even has like a little tiny like version of a lacrosse stick that he was given by his grandfather when he was about like 4 or 5 years old. So
Wow.
it's just part of who they are. And again, that erasure, right, of the fact that we're not, you know, not even considered to participate in those World Games, and that has, you know, a ripple effect and a huge impact on how we are seen and perceived throughout the world.
Yeah, thank you. Wow. I want to just come back a minute to immigration and the ripping of families apart. It has been a tried and true effective tool when we think about Black Americans, African Americans, and just the effectiveness of the transatlantic crossing and the use of ripping families apart for hundreds and hundreds of years. It is devastating on the family, and as you mentioned, that multi-generational impact of that trauma is absolutely incredible, and it's amazing. We know what happens. We know what this does. You know, it's just so devastating to see it play out again and again and again.
Yeah.
I had this, yesterday we chatted for just, or maybe Wednesday we chatted for a few minutes, and I said, I asked you if Canada is, you know, sort of worthy to be identified for the work that they are doing in the space with Canadian Indigenous peoples. In my readings, I am like, wow, with what they're doing, and you help frame that up for me a little bit, and I love that. And so I just wanted you to share a little bit about what's happening
Yeah.
in Canada.
So I think it was along the lines of, is Canada doing a better job treating their indigenous populations than the United States? Well, it depends on who you ask. So my husband's family and my family in Canada will probably give you a firm no. I mean, they are experiencing a significant amount of prejudice and racism, our First Nations brothers and sisters further north. I know that there's a lot of stuff going on right now at Six Nations, some treaty rights issues that they're trying to fight for right now. So they're facing a lot of discrimination right now over in that area. And I feel like they're kind of battling the same issues we are. here in the United States, their prime ministers have consistently waged wars against a lot of their stuff. They have a missing and murdered Indigenous women epidemic that they're fighting as well. And so you see a lot of the same issues mirrored. And I think the big difference between Canada and the United States is policy. They actually have written into their budget a significant amount of funds that need to go to print, radio, and television broadcasting to make sure that minority voices are heard. And so this is for, they actually have a whole like native PBS in Canada, the APTN. And they have like, cartoons all in Cree and Ojibwe for kids. They have native news. They have, multiple broadcast radio stations specifically on Indigenous issues. So again, when I'm talking about
policy, this is policy that's actually making a difference. This is a recognition.
Yeah, this is an intentional choice of the Canadian government to fund through revenue. And again, I work at Policy Matters Ohio, and policy matters. So when you make that intentional choice to start funding things and taking revenue and putting it towards issues that will help communities, this is the way that they chose to do it. So now we have a whole television station for Indigenous issues, multiple radio broadcast systems, print media. We don't have that in the United States because there was no intentional choice to dedicate in the budgets and revenue towards those issues. And now when you think about how much we're missing out here in the United States because we don't have that, when I'm sitting here like, here's a book, here's a podcast, here, you take all this extra effort and try and find these sources instead of just being able to switch the channel and getting your native news right there. And again, invisibility, erasure, that is the modern form of racism against our people. And we can change this if we make intentional easy choices through policy in the way that we bring in revenue and set our budgets. And again, I work at Policy Matters, and this is kind of what we do for the state budget. But we can have the communities and the life and the country and everything that we want if we make those choices through policy.
It's so very important. And I think, if you are a student or you are connected to a student in school, as we go into the season of holidays in which the truth is not told about the role of Indigenous Americans, holidays, we lift up one man who did not discover something that was already found and discovered and amazing. It is not just to be able to educate and support one teacher that you are engaged with, but begin to think about how that school and the school district and then the state can make policy that will change and impact the truth being told for everyone. This is why policy matters, and this is what we can do as individuals so that this next generation isn't wondering if there are any Native Americans in Congress. Yes, there are. And we've got to be able to understand what the power is in our own grasp and be able to make that change. I remember maybe a month ago reading a piece on a missing Indigenous woman who her appearance, this was in Canada, and her appearance, her hair was blonde. And so the police moved into action immediately, and there was a lot of media attention and focus around her. It was very, very high profile. And by the end of the week, as they began to have family spokespeople, coming forward, they realized that the woman was Indigenous, and everything changed.
Mm. Yeah, there's a lot of systemic and institutionalized racism that our communities face when it comes to our women. You can see that. I mean, I had a friend who actually just posted a picture of a Halloween costume because it's becoming Halloween. And for the record, this time of year is really rough for Native people. We were bombarded with the onslaught of, false stories from Columbus Day. Then we, come right up to Halloween, where we see a lot of the stereotypical costumes and imagery.
The equivalent of blackface people.
Yeah, and then you hit Thanksgiving, and then again, it's like that repeat of false history. And the Halloween, I feel, is like a really good example of how costumes in film too, fetishizing Native women, right? I actually dated somebody back in college who said that they were into me because they thought I was exotic. And I'm like, who's exotic here? Like, not me, because you're on my land. And so again, the fetishizing of Native women is directly one of the reasons that is causing this issue. So when we're talking about how Native people are presented in mainstream media, in our Halloween costumes and things like that, that does directly impact how we are thought of and treated in our day-to-day world.
When we did our first 21-day challenge in 2019, we invited you to write a blog, whatever you wanted to write about, wanted you to write a piece for us. And it was powerful. It was just absolutely, it was so sad and powerful at the same time. And I know, my team will be able to put that in the chat for those that didn't see it. But so many people really believe that there's an extinction, that there's that the erasure, the genocide is complete.
Yeah. So that piece, actually, I started writing it and I wasn't intending on writing that at all. I was going to write about the Urban Relocation Act in Cleveland, which is a federal policy that was enacted during the Termination Act, another really awful era of federal policy aimed to assimilate Native people through multiple actions. The relocation program was one of them, and they literally bused Native Americans from the reservation to about 8 select cities throughout the United States, and Cleveland was one of those cities. And it was chosen specifically because it was so far removed from reservations and other tribal communities. There's no federally recognized tribes in the state of Ohio. So they knew that they wouldn't be able to go back because it was so far. They wouldn't have connections to indigenous cultures. So they would turn white. And they would solve the Indian problem, quote unquote. That's literally what they called it, the federal government. They're dealing with the Indian problem. And so, yeah, I was going to write about that. But then I was thinking back to an experience I had in elementary school. And we're talking about, again, how Native people are portrayed and situated in how we digest their information. I'm at the Museum of Natural History. Again, I grew up in Detroit. Museum of Natural History in Ann Arbor. We went there for a field trip, and there's just floors of dinosaur bones, fossils, extinct animals, dodo birds, and we get to the last floor, and there's these wall full of dioramas of indigenous people, and one of them said Ottawa. I guess they tried to make it a little better by making it like Michigan tribe related. So I pointed to the Ottawa diorama, and I said, oh, I'm Ottawa like this. And my classmate said, you can't be Indian. Indians are extinct. And, as a kid, like, I was actually more upset about being called a liar. Like, I didn't understand the gravity of that. And it was fleeting. It was quick, right? And then we just moved on. And I actually learned, as I grew up, what that was and the gravity of that statement. But also, I know a lot of other Native students who have gone through, museums of natural history. Again, they get to that Native section and they have that same situation happen. I wish I could say that my case is the only case, but I have talked with some peers and Native friends, and they also have similar stories being told that their family's extinct. But I don't blame my classmate either, because the kid just saw floors of fossils, dinosaur bones, dodo birds. What kind of logical leap do we expect a child to make? And even in our own museum here in Cleveland, we have a beautiful quill box made by Yvonne Walker-Kishik, who's an indigenous woman. She's still alive. She's in my tribe. She's up in northern Michigan. We're friends on Facebook. My mom knows her really well, and it's she's a gorgeous quill box sitting next to moccasins from the early 1800s. And by any means, like the late 70s, that should be in the Museum of Contemporary Art, right? Not next to some 200-year-old moccasins. And so again, the way we're situating Native items, people, our history and our modern identities, it's always situated in the historical past. And we're always feathered and leathered. We're never like me and my family, my daughters. And that's what I ended up writing about, was that inability for people to more often see us as a modern people, and what that means, and that the harm that creates.
It's huge. I think, the modern context, the currency of now, and the vibrancy of the community is so very important. It's huge. It is part of why you're sort of helping, our staff to understand the importance and the legacy and the shoulders that we stand on, because of women like Wilma Mankiller. Women in many tribes across North America have a huge role within decision making, and just the framework of women is really powerful, almost more powerful historically than we see women in general. And that's sort of like a really wonderful to learn about and hear about and know about.
Yeah. So I did want to say one really quick thing before I forget. Before, back to the policy issue, and visibility and education. It pinged in my mind because I saw in the chat box the Becoming Visible report was shared. In that report, they found that they surveyed about 28 states in this report, and they found that only 9 states of those surveyed actually had funding dedicated for Native American curricula. So when we want to talk about how we're being situated in the historical past, and we have these misconceptions, and nobody's learning anything about Native people, and then I get called extinct in a museum at age 9, it's because, again, we talk about policy and budgets and revenue. Only 9 of these states actually dedicates funding to developing Native curricula. So that's a huge problem. If we want to talk about fixing it, maybe there is a place to start.
The truth is so amazing and beautiful and powerful and rich that this false narrative, I think, as we see it and root it out, again, we individually and collectively can do so much to elevating the truth again. And, we just can't underscore, you said what a difficult time of year this is. Let's work together. Let's work as allies in the Indigenous community to be able to say, hey, you have other costume options at our table as we gather our families. Let's begin talking and sharing about what we're learning and what the truth is around Native Indigenous Americans and the amazing role that they played in this country. It's just, it's huge.
When I was touring kindergartens for my daughter, when I was touring all these schools, one of the questions, you get the tour and then everyone comes to you, do you have any questions? And I would always raise my hand and ask them, how do you celebrate Thanksgiving in this school? And they were kind of like, what? Like, of all the things that I could ask. And I had to always clarify. And I said, well, my family's Indigenous, and I want to make sure that my daughters, because in elementary school, that's usually when you get in this story of Thanksgiving, that often is the first exposure to Native people that children get, right? So I want to make sure that what my kids are seeing, one of their first experiences of seeing Native people in the classroom, is reflective of what they see at home. And if that is not the case, then we need to talk about that. And so that narrowed down a few schools quite quickly. But yeah, I mean, constantly asking those questions and making sure that we're understanding how people, and not just Indigenous people too, I know that a lot of Black students are saying that they have, one of the first times they're taught about their people is through like slavery. And it's like this really awful, terrible, you know, it's like, can we start discussing Black people in a positive light, you know, at some point? And so there's a lot of discussion about just in general how we expose students to people of color for the first time and what context that looks like. But when you were talking about women in specific, Margaret, I know you were talking about that a little bit earlier. One of the cool things that happened recently was the election of 2 Native women into Congress, right? Deb Haaland, and like to Native women, that was incredible. To Indian country, period, that was incredible, right?
And they're from, is it Arizona or New Mexico? Am I wrong? Or
New Mexico.
Mexico, yeah.
And Kansas as well. So we have 2 Native women. We also have, I think, a lieutenant governor in Minnesota, or is it Wisconsin? Minnesota. And it's really cool to see these Native women take up these ranks, take up these titles, because traditionally in a lot of tribes, Native women had the political power.
That's right.
We were, you know, the backbones of tribal nations. We were the ones making the decisions, especially for my husband's tribe. It's a very matrilineal culture. The clan systems, they have something called clan mother, and all of the decisions are made from the clan mothers. They appoint the chiefs, right? They do have chiefs, but the clan mothers are the ones who appoint them. And it's, the reason they do that is traditionally is because, and this is what I was told, is they raise the children, so they know the type of people they are, right? So they know who would be a good leader, right. So they appoint the chiefs. And because they know the people and they know the children who are now adults, they have that wisdom and that, you know, we call it intellectual property of like who is who. And so they held all the political power, and colonization erased a lot of that political power for women because of the patrilineal nature of European culture. And so colonization wiped out a lot of that and really reduced the power of Native women in our traditional cultures. And we saw the election of all these Native women into Congress as like a rebirth and just like a reaffirmation of Native women in these roles in our tribes. And so we're hoping that this continues and we're seeing Native women regain that that political power.
Yeah, it's just incredible, powerful, very grounding. You asked a simple question. How does this school celebrate Thanksgiving? Mm-hmm. And, you know, I want to repeat that and pull that forward. This is a question we should all be asking as we interview schools. How do you celebrate Thanksgiving?
Yeah. And it's often not until I show up into the classroom. And I know for my daughters, the teachers all say that from daycare, from 3 months old to now, that they hadn't had a Native student in their class before until my daughter showed up. And it's when they show up that, you know, they realize, oh, I don't have any books by or about Native people. I don't have, like, maybe I should reconsider how I teach this this unit. And please, can you give me some resources? And fortunately, I have those resources, right? Like I have, you know, that access and understanding, and I teach the Kent class. And so I can give that to them, right? But it's not until I show up is it thought of. Again, invisibility, erasure, then, you know, we're not talked about and thought about. And so we need to start, our non-Native allies need to start asking these questions and really, you know, pushing this issue in their own classrooms, in their own homes as well. One of the things that I like to tell educators is to audit their curriculum. 87% of schools in the United States do not talk about Native Americans after 1900. 87%. We get to 1900 and then we're gone. Yeah. Again, how can you be Indian? Indians are extinct because we're not talked about in school after 1900. So have your school audit your curriculum and see, you know, how are we talked about, how are we portrayed, how are we sandwiched in history, like what is, you know, front and back, and try and figure out, you know, are you part of the problem? Is this something that we need to address? Do we talk about contemporary natives? Is it, merged into our history lessons as we would any other group in the United States? Or are we otherizing them by creating just a simple little unit on Native Americans and then like, that's it, job's done, brush your shoulders, check the box.
That's right.
How are we taught? And so as a parent or an educator, that is a really easy first step that you can take, is to audit your school district's curriculum.
And we've been talking about education, but we can take this same approach into our workplace. We can take the same approach into our communities of faith. We can take this same approach into our neighborhood, into our home. It is the same approach that is going to really be the critical difference maker. So we've been talking about, women in Congress. There's a question in the chat around voting and whether Indigenous people have a right to vote and what voter suppression has looked like. Could you speak to that a little bit?
First of all, Native Americans weren't considered United States citizens until well after women in this country could vote with the Citizenship Act, which is a double-edged sword. A lot of Natives saw that as a strike against their sovereignty. We don't need to be United States. We're already citizens of a country. So that is a double-edged sword. But then we were not allowed to vote for quite some time. And I think it was New Mexico was the last state to ratify that and make it so that Natives could vote. And it was, I think, in 1968, 1965, that all Native Americans in the United States could vote. And it's interesting that it would be a state like New Mexico, right? When we talk about power of voting, right? In which states are not allowing certain populations to voice to put their voice in democracy. It's these states where we have high concentrations of Native Americans. So yeah,
people see the U.S. as a democracy in 1776 and all of these pieces. But again, we really have to come back to understanding it is 1965, 1968, where we are fully approaching one person, one vote democracy in the United States.
Yeah.
Even that is a reframing and a rethinking of what many have known to be true their entire lives. It really does disrupt.
No, and voting is a huge thing, and we are facing a lot of incidences of voter suppression. I'm not sure if everyone on this call has heard about issues in the Dakotas where they were removing the ability to get your ballots and everything through your P.O. box. Like everything, your voter registration had to be through an actual street address. Well, on the res, a lot of places don't have street addresses. They're very rural. So that was like a clear attack against Indigenous nations, so they couldn't exercise their right to vote. Right now, we have like a really huge movement for getting out the vote. And there's actually a really cool, if you go to illuminatives.org, they have a really awesome toolkit for voting. NCAI has a really amazing, the National Congress of American Indians has great efforts to get out the vote. And we have decided elections in a number of states. It's not like, we're a small portion of the population, but we have had a huge role in deciding the fates of many state senators and representatives. So, everyone talks about the Black vote, the Latinx vote, and for a lot of states, you need to look out for that Native vote, and we are voting. And it's we're super excited for this upcoming election. There is a lot of get out the vote opportunities and efforts. So hopefully we can see these numbers increase for registration and votes.
We're both big fans of Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanova, who is a Native Indigenous American who has spent his career working in philanthropy. And in the book, Decolonizing Wealth, he really pulls back the curtain. Not only on his own personal experiences, but also on really recognizing philanthropy as, sort of maintaining in so many ways, colonization in terms of, how money who was made on the backs of Native Americans and Blacks. And he starts out his story at the Duke Foundation, which is so steep, or was it Reynolds? Was it R.J. Reynolds where he was at? But just steeped in tobacco. right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, there's his whole I mean, highly recommend this book. I work in development, so I always try to read books like these that kind of give me a little bit of an insight about what's going on the other side. But one of the big things he pulled out is that of all the giving that's been done, and there's also another report done by Native Americans in Philanthropy, which he's the chair of the board of, Edgar Villanueva, and Candid, formerly known as Foundation Center. And
that's right. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
um, so they put out a big report. It was the end of last year, and they found that only 0.4% of all giving in the United States, I think something like $800 billion of wealth that's given philanthropically in this country, and only 0.4, it's like 0.4, like less than 1%, is given to Indigenous communities. And it ranges from a high and low, but it's always under 1%. And I think as a whole, they found out that 7 to 8% is given to communities of color. So we're talking about immense amounts of wealth that is built on the backs of people of color, whether through land acquisitions, resource acquisitions, slavery. They build this immense amount of wealth. I think, I want to say, was it Ford Foundation? There was someone who gave a really great example of how the logging industry, they make a lot of their wealth through the logging industry, but then gave a grant to an Indigenous community to fight the logging industry. So you're stuck in this weird like catch-22 of how to dedicate money. So that's kind of where Edgar Villanueva is coming around, what he's really exposing. And I think another thing that this report found is that of the 1,000 large US foundations, only 20% of them gave at least one grant explicitly to Indigenous communities. 20% gave one grant. And of that, about half of them only gave that one grant. That's it. So when we're talking about wealth and how it's gained and earned and kept, right? And especially now in this time of reckoning, it's pretty stark of who's not getting that level of equity right now.
Where we are is it's a powerful system, and it is by design. It works effectively. Isabel Wilkerson, in her new book, Caste, C-A-S-T-E, really identifies the caste system, and we see this playing out so effectively. Follow the money. It matches with the framing, the erasure, the invisibleness, the minimizing, the absolute assault on the mind and the psyche of Native Indigenous peoples and children, and on the psyche of all of us around, what we believe about this people group. And I can't believe that we are at an hour. It is absolutely flown by. But I want you to just take a moment and talk about what you hope for. You shared a beautiful photo of your mother, and you are your mother's daughter. And
was that my grandma? I think it was
my grandmother. Yes.
My Nokomis, yeah.
Yeah, I love that photo. And you clearly are your grandmother's granddaughter, your mother's daughter, and you have daughters. Talk about not just the vision for your children, but the vision, hold out a vision for all of us and all of our children going forward around Native Americans. Give us that view.
Well, that's a very heavy question and a huge answer. So I'll answer it around kind of where I'm coming from and my issue around identity and visibility, right? I hope that my children and my grandchildren won't have to fight to define who they are and won't have definitions put on them, and they will be comfortable and secure and strong about who they are as Anishinaabekwe. Native women, Anishinaabe women. So I really hope that these misconceptions and these stereotypes will go away, and we will have the strength and the ability to fill that void with who we are, the real us. And I really hope that tribal sovereignty is strengthened, that people are educated about who we are, not educated in our history, of course, right? But also our issues today. And that we get a strong team of non-Native allies to help us in that fight. Again, nobody can do this alone. So that's my vision and my hopes for my children and grandchildren.
It's a beautiful vision, and I can see myself in my role in that. And I am thrilled to be able to play my part in supporting that for all of our children. As always, I love talking with you. It's just so empowering for me, and I hope that everybody who's been able to join us today has enjoyed the conversation as well. And please join us next week. We look forward to having you. We have Dawn Harris. She is with NASCAR, and we're going to have an amazing conversation about what NASCAR has been up to, and they've been up to it for a while, even though we're just now seeing some of the outcomes. Again, Cynthia, thank you. You're amazing, awesome, inspiring, beautiful, powerful, fun, joyful.
Good company, Margaret.
So thank you. Thank you.
I love the work that you and the YWCA do, and thank you so much for being such a great partner and ally in all the work that we do.
Well, thank you for being such a big part of our work. You joined us on our strategic planning journey, and we're so proud of that plan. Have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy. Bye-bye, everybody.